I accidentally held a stranger's hand in the emergency room at 2 a.m, and somehow that's how all of this started. I want to be clear. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know anything about him, except that he was pale and shaking, and his blood pressure had dropped twice in the last hour, and that when his hand reached out from under the blanket and grabbed my wrist, I didn't pull away. I just held on. The way you do when someone looks scared enough that letting go feels cruel. That's the whole story, really, except it isn't. My name is Laurel Finch. I'm 26 years old. I grew up in Kitchener, Ontario, and at the time I was working night shifts in the emergency department at Toronto General. The kind of shifts that start at 11 and end at 7, and turn Tuesday into Thursday without you noticing. I'd been doing it for 2 years. I was tired in that way that becomes so normal, you stop calling it tired and just call it how you feel. The night he came in, I was already running on fumes. We'd had a full board since midnight. A man with a broken wrist from a hockey game. A teenager who'd eaten something she was allergic to and didn't carry her EpiPen. A woman in her 70s with chest pain, who kept insisting she was fine, just a little heartburn, who wasn't fine at all. By the time they wheeled him in, I'd already done more paperwork than I'd done in some entire weeks, and I was standing at the nurse's station eating a granola bar I'd found in my locker that may or may not have expired in October. He came in through the ambulance bay. I heard the paramedics before I saw him. Something about a laceration, blood pressure inconsistent, possible internal bruising. My charge nurse, Gwen, caught my eye and tilted her head toward Bay 4. I shoved the rest of the granola bar in my mouth and went. He was lying on the gurney with his eyes half open and his jaw set tight, like he was working very hard at something. Staying conscious, maybe. Or staying calm. 2 men had come in with him. Big men, wearing dark coats, who stood just outside the curtain and watched everything with the kind of attention that felt less like concern and more like surveillance. I noted them. Didn't say anything. You see all kinds at 2 a.m. He was maybe 34, 35. Dark hair, a few days of stubble. He was wearing what had been, before whatever happened to him, a very nice shirt. The kind of shirt that costs more in a single purchase than I made in a week. It was torn at the side now, and there was blood on it, and he was holding his ribs like that might help. "Hi," I said, which is always what I say. "I'm Laurel, I'm your nurse tonight. Can you tell me your name?" He looked at me. His eyes were dark gray, which I noticed because people don't usually have dark gray eyes, and I notice things like that. He said his name was Remy. "Okay, Remy. Can you tell me what happened?" "I fell," he said. I looked at him. He looked back at me. "Okay," I said. "I've been doing this long enough to know when someone is telling me what happened, and when someone is telling me what they'd like me to write down. The two things don't always match. My job is not to investigate. My job is to make sure the person in front of me doesn't die, and I'm very good at my job, so I put on gloves and got to work." He had a deep laceration along his left side that needed cleaning and suturing. 2 ribs that were bruised but not broken, doctor. Vasquez confirmed this after we got the imaging back, which Remy had accepted with an expression that suggested he'd been expecting worse. His blood pressure stabilized once we got fluids in him. He was going to be fine. That much was clear within the first 40 minutes. What wasn't clear was why the 2 men in dark coats kept making phone calls outside the curtain, speaking in low voices that stopped every time I came near. At some point around 3 a.m, Remy's blood pressure dipped again. Not dangerously, but enough that I came in to check on him and found him with his eyes closed, and his breathing too shallow, and his hand hanging off the edge of the gurney, like he'd been trying to reach something and fallen asleep doing it. I should have just checked his IV line and his monitor numbers and left. Instead, I stood there for a moment, and then I took his hand, just wrapped both of mine around it, the way I used to do with my grandmother when she was sick and didn't need anything from me medically, just needed to know there was another person in the room. His eyes opened. We looked at each other. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to wake you." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Don't go." I stayed for another 10 minutes, which is not something I normally do, which I cannot explain, even now, except to say that there are some moments where the professional thing and the right thing aren't exactly the same thing, and I've always been better at right than professional. I found out who he was 3 days later, which is when he came back. Not as a patient. He walked through the emergency department doors on a Thursday afternoon in November, wearing a different shirt, also very nice, no blood this time, with one of the dark coat men behind him. He asked for me by name at the desk. Gwen paged me with a tone in her voice I hadn't heard her use before, and when I came out front and saw him standing there, I stopped walking. "You're not dying," I said. "No," he said. "I wanted to thank you. People thank their nurses sometimes. It's kind, and I appreciate it, and it usually involves a card or a box of Tim Hortons Timbits left at the nursing station. It doesn't usually involve showing up in person 3 days later, looking like you've slept and showered and made a decision." He took me for coffee. I said yes because I was between patients, and Gwen told me to go. Practically pushed me out the door. We went to the cafe on the ground floor, which smells like burnt espresso and has chairs that are slightly too close to the heating vent, and he bought me a medium dark roast and himself a black coffee, and we sat down. His full name was Remy Callahan, that's what he told me. He said he worked in real estate development. He said he had offices downtown on King Street. He said he was sorry for being difficult the night he came in, and I said he hadn't been difficult, and he gave me a look that suggested he knew exactly how difficult he'd been, and was choosing to appreciate the lie. He asked how long I'd been nursing. I told him 2 years at Toronto General, 3 years before that at St. Mary's in Kitchener, when I was still doing my placement hours. He asked if I liked it. I told him I loved it, most days. He asked what a day I didn't love it looked like, and I told him about the paperwork, and he laughed. Actually laughed, not politely, but like I'd said something genuinely funny, and I noticed the way his whole face changed when he did. I didn't ask him how he'd gotten hurt. He didn't offer. We talked for 40 minutes, and by the end of it I had agreed to have dinner with him on Saturday, which I still can't fully account for, except that he asked directly, and without any of the usual hedging and uncertainty. And there's something about a man who says what he wants. Clearly that short-circuits my better judgment. Saturday dinner turned into a walk along the waterfront because he'd made a reservation at a restaurant and I'd told him, in the car on the way there, that I'd eaten at that restaurant once and found it pretentious, and he'd paused for a second and then said, "Okay, what do you actually want to do?" And I'd said I didn't know, maybe walk, and so we walked. It was cold the way Toronto is cold in November. That damp, searching cold that finds you through your jacket. And he bought me a hot chocolate from a cart near the ferry terminal and kept his pace matched to mine, which men don't always bother to do. He told me he'd grown up in Montreal, moved to Toronto at 22. He said he didn't have much family anymore, said it the way people say things they've made their peace with. I told him my parents were still in Kitchener, that my younger brother Eli was at Waterloo doing computer science, that I saw them most Christmases, and sometimes Thanksgiving if my shifts lined up. He listened the way people listen when they actually want to know, not when they're waiting for their turn to talk. I didn't think about the dark coat men. I should have. I didn't. The third time I saw him he came to the hospital again, but this time it wasn't to see me. I found out because Gwen mentioned, casually, that there'd been a man in with administration that morning, something about a facilities review. She didn't know his name. I had a feeling, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't being paranoid. Remy called me that evening and told me himself. He said it carefully, the way you say things you know are going to land badly. He said that his development company had acquired several properties in the downtown core, including the building that leased space to Toronto General's outpatient clinic on Dundas. He said he wanted me to hear it from him before I heard it from anyone else. I sat on my couch with my phone pressed to my ear and the TV on mute, and I thought about the outpatient clinic, about the people I'd seen there on the days I covered, the seniors who came in for their weekly check-ins, the families who couldn't afford to drive across the city to a different location, the woman with the mobility issues who'd told me once that this clinic was the only one on her bus route. "What are you planning to do with the building?" I asked. He paused. "Redevelop it. Mixed use. Residential and commercial." "And the clinic?" Another pause. "The lease has a termination clause." I didn't say anything for a while. He didn't fill the silence, which I noticed because most people fill silences. "I need to think," I said. "Okay," he said. "Remy, yeah, I need to actually think." "Not tonight, I know," he said. "I'll be here." I didn't call him back for 4 days. I want to say I spent those 4 days thinking clearly and logically, but honestly I spent them tired and angry and going back and forth so many times in my own head that I started to feel seasick. I talked to Gwen, who told me this kind of thing happened all the time, and I shouldn't take it personally. I talked to Eli, who said that real estate developers weren't inherently evil, and maybe I should ask more questions before I made up my mind. I talked to my friend Roshani, who is a social worker and who said, very flatly, that I knew what I thought and I was just scared to think it. She was right. She's usually right. I knew 2 things. 1. What Remy was planning to do was going to hurt people who didn't have a lot of other options. 2. I had feelings for him that were real and inconvenient, and not going away just because I was angry. On the 4th day I called him back. I want to meet, I said. In person. Where? My neighborhood. There's a diner on Bloor near Bathurst. Sunday morning. He showed up before I did, which I hadn't expected. He was already in a booth with 2 coffees on the table, and when I came in and saw him I had to stop for a second, just to get my face right. I sat down. I said, I'm not going to pretend this doesn't matter to me. I know, he said. The clinic serves people who don't have other choices. If the lease gets terminated, some of those people, not all of them, but some, are going to fall through the cracks. That's not dramatic, that's just what happens. He looked at me steadily. He said, I know. Then why? Because I didn't know it. Not in the way you're describing it until you said it to me right now. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. I've done this kind of deal 40 times. I've never had someone sit across from me and make me think about what happens to the woman who takes the bus. I looked at him. That's not a reason, that's just you being affected by knowing me. Maybe, he said. But it's also a reason. We sat with that for a while. He didn't promise me he'd scrap the project. He said he'd have his team look at the numbers on relocating the clinic, finding them another space in the same neighborhood, covering the moving costs, ensuring continuity of service. He said he'd have a real answer for me in 2 weeks. He said he wasn't going to promise something. He wasn't sure he could deliver. And I said that was the most honest thing he'd said to me since we met, and he said he'd take that. I want to tell you that those 2 weeks were easy. They weren't. I went to work and came home and went to work again, and I thought about him more than I wanted to, and twice I almost called him just to hear his voice and talked myself out of it both times. Roshani told me I was being a romantic martyr, and I told her she was right, but I was going to do it anyway. Then, on the 10th day, something happened that changed things faster than I was ready for. I was coming off a shift at 7 in the morning, barely awake, when Gwen stopped me at the door. She had her phone in her hand, and a look on her face I recognized, the look she gets when something has just become significantly more complicated. You should look at this, she said, and handed me the phone. It was a news article. Local Toronto business section, time-stamped 4 hours earlier. The headline said, Callahan Group under investigation for alleged ties to organized crime. There was a photo of Remy getting into a car outside an office building on Bay Street. I read the article twice. Then I read it a 3rd time, the way you do when you're hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something less severe. I drove home. I sat on my couch. I did not go to sleep, though I needed to. I called Remy. He picked up on the 2nd ring. You saw it, he said. Is it true? A silence. And then, it's complicated, Remy. I'm not going to lie to you, he said. My family, my father's side, had ties to people I don't have ties to anymore. When I built this company, I built it clean. But history follows you, especially when someone wants it to. Is that the whole story? No, he said. But it's the part that's mine to tell you. The rest is, it's not mine. I sat there for a long time after we hung up. I thought about the night in Bay 4, when he'd held on to my wrist. I thought about the drive to the restaurant where we didn't eat, and the hot chocolate at the ferry terminal, and the way he'd said, I know 3 times in a row in that diner booth, and meant it differently each time. I thought about what Eli would say, and what Roshani would say, and what I would say if one of them came to me with this same story and asked me what to do. What I would say is, what do you actually know? Not what you're afraid of. What do you actually know? What I knew was that Remy had not lied to me. He had withheld things. There was a difference, and that was complicated, but it wasn't the same. What I knew was that he had told me himself, before anyone else could, both times. The clinic, and this. What I knew was that the investigation didn't name him as a perpetrator. It named his family history. I also knew that none of that made me less angry, and I knew that being angry was fine. Being angry didn't mean I was wrong to have feelings. It meant I was paying attention. I went to sleep. I slept for 6 hours. When I woke up, I called him back. "I'm not walking away," I said. "But I need you to understand something. Tell me, if I find out you've lied to me, not kept something private, not held something back while you figured out how to tell me, but actually lied, I'm done. Not because I don't understand complicated histories, because I need to be able to trust what you tell me." "Okay," he said. "That's it, just okay? What else do you want me to say, Laurel?" I thought about it. "Nothing," I said. "Okay is fine." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been calling you Nurse Finch in my head this whole time, and I've been trying to find a way to ask if that bothers you." It startled a laugh out of me, which I think was his intention. "Does it bother you?" "No," he said. I don't know. It fits. Remy, yeah. You can call me Laurel, I know," he said. "And then I think I'm going to keep calling you Finch." He did. He called me Finch the night he introduced me to his lawyer, Marcus, who was the most alarmingly calm man I'd ever met, and who told me over dinner in a quiet restaurant on Queen Street West that the investigation was looking increasingly like a fishing expedition, driven by a competitor who wanted to stall the King Street development. He called me Finch the day the clinic situation resolved. They found a ground floor unit 2 blocks away, more accessible than the original space, and Remy's company covered the first 2 years of rent and the cost of the move. I cried a little in the car afterward, which I'll admit to. He pretended not to notice, which was the right call. He called me Finch on a Sunday in March when we were at my parents' house in Kitchener for the first time, and my mother served butter tarts and looked at him the way she looks at people she's decided she likes before they've finished their first cup of tea. My dad talked to him for 2 hours about the Leafs, and Eli showed him something on his laptop that I didn't understand, and that Remy apparently did. And by the time we drove back to the city that night, I felt something settle in my chest that I'd been carrying around loose for months. The investigation was dropped in April. No charges, no findings. Remy sent me a text when he found out, just 3 words, "It's over, Finch." I read it standing in the break room at the hospital with my coffee going cold in my hand. And I thought about Bay 4, and the granola bar, and the 2 men in dark coats, and blood on the nice shirt. And I thought about how none of that should have led here. But it did. I've been nursing long enough to know that bodies are stubborn things. People come in broken in ways that look permanent, and then they aren't. The body wants to survive. It will do remarkable, inexplicable things in the direction of surviving. I've seen it enough times that I've stopped being surprised by it. I think people are a little like that too. Remy still calls me Finch. I still tell him when he's being difficult. He still asks what I actually want, in restaurants and in conversations, and in the quiet after hard days, and I've gotten better at telling him. We're not a simple story. I don't think either of us was ever going to be a simple story. But I held his hand in the dark at 2 in the morning, when he was scared and didn't want to be alone, and he never forgot it, and neither did I.